Let's see if we have Tucker Goodrich now with us. How are you, sir?
I'm good, David. How are you?
Doing great. Thank God we got you back. I've been missing you. We didn't get to talk last week, but I know that you've been out dealing with a lot of these plant-based people pushing back against your critique of the vegetable oil problem, which is the big heart of so much of what's going wrong with our bodies today. And so I thought maybe we could spend some time unpacking this plant-based movement and what you've seen from it so far. Obviously, we don't want to demonize individuals, but there is a movement afoot to really try to replace almost everything that was animal-based with completely plant-based nutrition. And there's good plant-based nutrition, but there's also things where it goes too far. What has been your overall experience engaging with the vegan or plant-based community in what you've done so far online with nutrition?
Online, overall, it's been exceedingly poor. Exceedingly poor. Now, let me start this by saying the oldest vegetarian population on Earth is a group known as the Jains. They're an Indian religious group. It's very closely associated with Hinduism, and their vegetarian tradition goes back thousands of years. And they're quite a successful group in India. I shared an office with a practicing Jain for about 2.5 years while I was on Wall Street, and I was then, as now, very skeptical about vegetarianism and especially veganism, and it was really great. It was a great learning experience for me to share that office with a Jain, because I'm not going to use his name here, but because I've never met anybody who was so conscious of the shortcomings of a vegetarian diet as this fellow who came from a culture of practicing vegetarians for thousands of years. And his view was that it was a religious duty and a moral duty, and that part of the benefit of it to them was that it was a sacrifice. And they knew that it was a sacrifice. And he explained to me all the things that they did, you know, like, for instance, consuming dairy, which they considered to be problematic, but they recognized that it was necessary for human health to consume some amount of dairy. And this was, you know, I mean, to understand the amount of thought that the Jains have put into the practice of their religion and the practice of their vegetarian diet, one has to realize that they deduced the presence of microbes in food thousands of years ago, thousands of years before they were known in the West, right? So this is not a casual thing for them. They've put an enormous amount of thinking into this diet. So I had an enormous amount of respect for him after having that conversation, and the main reason was that he was honest about it. He was honest about the health shortcomings of it, and he explained why they thought it was worth it, and why they didn't go to some of the extremes that some of the Jain monks, for instance, would go to. For instance, never bathing, because if you bathe, you're killing the microbes that live on your body, right? He bathed, thank heavens, because I was in an office with him for 2.5 years, and, you know, he consumed yogurt, although he knew that he was consuming microbes in eating yogurt, because he recognized that some consumption of animal products was necessary, and that was the least destructive way to do it, right? So the difference between that fellow and my experience with the online vegetarian and vegan communities has been that they're not honest about what they're doing, right? It's not enough for them to be doing the right thing and trying to propagate doing the right thing, which is fine, but they've got to misrepresent what they're doing. And they misrepresent it in two ways. One, they misrepresent it by trying to claim that it's the healthiest thing that you can do. Well, I guess that's really the main way that they misrepresent it, is they claim that there's a health benefit to it. And it's not really clear that there is a health benefit to it. And in certain cases, it's very clear that there is a noticeable negative effect from pursuing particularly a vegan diet, especially on children.
To A Neighbor's Choice Radio. I'm your host, David Gornoski. We're talking about veganism, the plant-based community, particularly its community online that Tucker Goodrich, our guest, has encountered in his crusade against the toxic effects of vegetable seed oils like corn oil and soybean oil, canola oil, these ubiquitous products that are driving a lot of the inflammation and metabolic dysfunction that undergirds so many different diseases, including people's severe cases of COVID, as we've demonstrated with a lot of scientists in our previous episodes. So, Tucker, I want to return to your thought there. You said that there's something that you respect the classical vegetarians, like the Jains community and your friend, but you don't like the tone of dishonesty and sleight of hand that you hear with the plant-based community that you've engaged with online. Now, isn't it true, though, that there are a good percentage, maybe you could give me a spitball image, how much of the vegetarians online are probably also skeptical of the health effects of vegetable oils, right? Would that be 20% of them maybe online?
How many are skeptical of the health effects of what?
Of vegetable oils.
There are some, in fact, but generally they're doing, in my experience, generally these are people who are skeptical of fat in general, and they want you to reduce vegetable oils because they want you to reduce all fats. And there's an argument to be made for that. I mean,
what about the raw vegan diet? The raw vegan people would be against vegetable oils, right?
I presume so. I mean, raw veganism is one of those things that's so out there that I just can't take it very seriously at all, because we literally have evolved to the point where it's impossible for us to survive on a raw vegan diet. And people, from everything I've read, who go on a raw vegan diet generally get quite sick quite quickly. So that's kind of the fringe of the fringe, right?
You see a lot of those people on there's some loud voices for the raw vegan community, though, on Instagram and social media platforms, They didn't know how big it is. I've never dived into the community. I guess you've had a few encounters with them, so I just wanted to get your take.
Yeah, I mean, they've done, there was a study that they did in Germany where they looked at raw vegans, and they were not a healthy bunch. And it's interesting that even humans who eat all raw food, including raw meat, don't do all that well, because we've pretty much evolved to the point where we're dependent on cooked food, right? So, yeah, maybe if we went back, I don't know, when we discovered fire, I think it was like 700,000 years ago. We had rather small brains 700,000 years ago, but we did pretty well by discovering fire and starting to cook our food, and that's one of the things that allowed us to grow big brains. So yeah, raw vegans are the fringe of the fringe, and that's pretty much all that, but what you said there, they're very loud, that's pretty much all that any of these vegan and vegetarian groups have going for them, is that they're pretty loud. I listened to a really interesting podcast a while back, and I put a post up on my blog about it, and it was an interview by a guy, David Klurfeld, who is the National Program Leader for Human Nutrition in the Agricultural Research Service of the United States Department of Agriculture. He was the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American College of Nutrition, and he is currently the associate editor of the American Journal for Clinical Nutrition. So this is a guy who's top in his field, and what this story was really interesting, what made this story so interesting to me is that you may have heard in the news about how it's claimed now that meat causes cancer, right? And it turns out he's an expert in that particular area of science, and he's such an expert that he was actually asked to be on the World Health Organization's panel that ultimately generated the document that came out that claimed to show that meat causes cancer. And he went through two things in this interview. He went through the research, or rather I should say the lack of research showing that, because there is some epidemiological research showing a very, very weak association only for processed meat, none for red meat. And then his key point was people have attempted to induce cancer in animals by feeding them meat, and it doesn't work. In fact, one guy tried to induce cancer by feeding them lots and lots of bacon and then giving them a carcinogen. And the bacon actually protected the rats from getting cancer. Right? So what happened? So how do we get from there, a lack of evidence, to meat causes cancer, which is now the official position of the World Health Organization? They just ignored the evidence. And who is they? Well, it turns out that about a third, at least, of the people on this committee were vegetarians. And they just elected to ignore all of the evidence that contradicted their position. And he said that as far as he could tell, a lot of the people showed up, they'd already made up their minds. They had no need to look at the research. And the research they looked at didn't show what they claimed ultimately that it showed. So this is my problem. You know, we have quote-unquote scientists, and the title of the podcast that I listened to was Bogus Vegetarian Scientists. We have scientists who claim to be doing science, and what they're doing is cherry-picking so that they can mislead us into following a vegetarian or a vegan diet.
Well, do you think that the big critique about seed oils that's being made is really going to cut the heart of the vegetarian movement out? Because you can't, like, how do you really get your oils? I guess you can do coconut oil, right? But, I mean, is that why they're getting so vicious against people like you, Tucker? Because if you really debunk the quality of the health of seed oils, you really undercut a lot of their whole sustainability as a movement?
Well, that's there's a scientific argument, right, that says, that looks at the pros and cons of vegetable foods and says, okay, some vegetable foods are toxic, some vegetable foods are beneficial to you, and, is objective about what shows, right? So, unfortunately, since this is fundamentally a religious movement and not a scientific movement, a lot of these folks get upset when you suggest that anything that comes from a vegetable could be harmful to you in any way, even though that's clearly ridiculous, right? I mean, for instance, celiac is a disease that is quite serious, that about 1 in 100 people have, that's caused by consuming wheat, period, right? You have to have some genetic markers for it, and there seems to be another environmental trigger. But if you don't consume wheat, you don't get celiac disease, ever. Right. So, if you're objective about this, you should be able to say, okay, maybe too much vegetable oil is a bad thing, which is what the U.S. dietary guideline says, where, the recommended consumption of vegetable oil is capped at 10% because there's some concern that more than that can lead to cardiovascular disease problems. or you're just going to say, no, there's no evidence that vegetables are bad for you under any circumstance, which is clearly not justified by the science that we know. I mean, right. That's a religious position.
Right. So I want to go back to what is the fundamental dishonesty about today's modern vegan movement that is at the heart of what they're saying that's not true?
The fundamental dishonesty is that they can't do what my colleague did, which is say that it's a moral movement and that it has some health issues associated with it. Some vegans do that. I mean, for instance, there are vegans, for instance, one of the biggest issues, putting vegetarian, why do Indian vegetarians consume dairy? Because dairy has vitamin B12 in it. And humans require consuming vitamin B12 in the diet, and there are no plant-based sources of vitamin B12, period. Right? So that's why they consume dairy, because otherwise you get super sick and die. Right? But they're fine. They say, look, we are making a sacrifice here. We believe there's a good moral reason for doing it. Now, you can disagree with that moral reason, but the Jains don't go out and proselytize, right? They don't try and go out and convert people to Jainism, in my experience, maybe perhaps with one exception.
Let's hold that thought. We'll be right back with Tucker Goodrich on the other side to explore what veganism is getting fundamentally incorrect. Back after that. Neighbor's Choice Radio. I'm your host, David Gornoski, here with Tucker Goodrich. His blog is yelling-stop.blogspot.com. You can also find him on YouTube. Search for Tucker Goodrich, where he's got his own podcast he's developing called Debugging Life, right, Tucker?
Yes, Tucker Goodrich, Debugging Life. So if you Google my name on YouTube, it'll come up. And my co-host for some of the episodes is Dr. Brian Curley, who you interviewed as the seed oil disrespecter before he came out from behind his nom de plume, or I guess I should call it nom de Twitter.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you guys, Debugging Life refers to the fact that you will not eat the bugs. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would eat bugs under the right circumstances, but it more refers to my technology background, where I'm trying to figure out through a methodical process what is the right thing to do in life and how to navigate oneself through these little problems, like this vegetarian issue.
Uh-oh. I thought you were being rated already. Do we still have Tucker?
Sorry about that.
I thought you were being rated live on radio for criticizing the bugs.
Yeah. So sorry about that. So anyway, it's more about trying to figure things out and trying to be methodical and rational about it and come to the right conclusions on difficult issues.
So what's the conclusion that you've come to the vegan community as you've understood it so far in their arguments?
They're dishonest. That's my conclusion in a nutshell.
So they're self-deluded, like a typical kind of, like a religious movement that kind of doubles down on some doctrines that don't touch with reality. Is that what it is?
That's exactly correct. That is exactly correct. And they, from the ones I've encountered, and there are no, speaking specifically about vegans here, there are no exceptions to this. They are not willing to rationally examine the foundations and the evidence that contradicts some of their positions.
Now, you've had a few debates recently with some of these plant-based doctors, right? Or who have you talked to recently? You've debated somebody.
I had a debate with a fellow called Matt Nagra. He's a naturopath, so he's not a physician in Canada, about is it reasonable basically to take seed oils to improve your cardiovascular health? And that turned out to be, he was a nice enough fellow, at least at first, and it was really interesting. I'm actually doing a blog post about that, and I went through the references that he used, and the first two of them were gross misrepresentations. And there were lots of other misrepresentations in there. For instance, he cited a paper that's known as Hooper 2020, which looks at the benefits of, removing saturated fat and replacing it with seed oils. And he drilled down to, I think it was page 89 or something, and said, look, there's a benefit here. And I said, okay, well, let's go back to the first page, where they say there is little to no benefit derived from doing this in cardiovascular disease health or any other part of health. So that was his opening slide, and he had to skip the first 89 pages to get to something that supported his position. Now, an honest person would start with that and say, but, let's look at this little aspect of health that it does improve. And as I pushed him on it, we finally got to that point. I don't particularly agree even with that aspect of it, because there's another way to interpret it that, anyway, we won't go down that rabbit hole. It turned into a 4-hour debate, so if you really want to get a good dose of it, you can go there. But he couldn't make a straight argument. He couldn't, because the highest level of evidence in medicine is a human trial to test if something works. And the trials that we've had of seed oils for cardiovascular disease health, most of them show that it makes it worse. Right?
So why is it still being recommended by the American Heart Association?
I can't answer the why. I mean, their American Heart Association in 2001 wrote a paper about the most successful cardiovascular disease trial ever, which was the Lyon Diet Heart Study. And that was the only one that tried to reduce the fats in seed oils in our diet. And it was the most successful one ever, 70% reduction in cardiovascular disease in people who already had cardiovascular disease. And it caused the American Heart Association to change their diet recommendations. That was the beginning of their recommending a Mediterranean diet. And they never mentioned what this scientist said was a core part of his intervention, which was cutting back on the omega-6 fats. And, refuting the position of the guy who got the American Heart Association to start recommending seed oils in the first place back in 1961, Ansel Keys. It was a direct test of his hypothesis, and it refuted it. And they never mentioned that when they wrote their own paper. So why wouldn't they be honest about what the evidence says? Why wouldn't they say, hey, we've been, doing this all along, and look, there are a bunch of tests. There have been a bunch of tests of this idea, and they don't work very well, and the best you can say is that there's little to no evidence supporting this recommendation of ours, right? Why can't they just come out and say that? I don't know what the why is. I'm not a mind reader.
Right. So they start with an ethical, religious impulse, and then they're trying to backload into it scientific arguments that really don't stand up.
Well, the head of the American Heart Association was a vegan until recently.
Mm.
So you can draw what conclusions you would like from that.
Who did you mean till recently? What did he do? He started eating beef or what?
No. I think his term ended.
Oh, okay. Who do they have now?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't pay all of that much attention to the AHA.
Well, a lot of people do. That's why we're talking about them. I mean, it's just these entities are giants and they're dinosaurs, but dinosaurs seem to have a slow death, unfortunately, in terms of, wrong think institutions.
You know what? I'm mistaken. It wasn't the American Heart Association. Kim Williams was the first vegan president of the American College of Cardiology, which obviously has some interaction with the so my bad there. Why did they continue to push this? I mean, there's a fellow named John Sabate, and I'm probably mispronouncing his first name, so my apologies. He is a professor of nutrition at Loma Linda University in California. Loma Linda is the head university of the Seventh-day Adventist network of schools and hospitals. And the Seventh-day Adventists are the premier promoters of vegetarian and vegan diets, right?
Right.
So the profession of dietitian was created by the Seventh-day Adventist Church as a way to spread their dietary teachings, right? So every time you talk to a dietitian, you are talking to somebody who is following in the footsteps of the vegetarian founder of the dietitian profession. He wrote he is, I believe, still on the, expert committee of the U.S. Dietary Guidelines. And he is a self-described medical missionary for the Adventist Church.
Welcome back to A Neighbor's Choice Radio. I'm David Gornoski here with Tucker Goodrich. So, Tucker, I just wanted to help you land the plane here. Some concluding thoughts to summarize what we've explored thus far. You've basically announced that you're going vegan, right?
Yeah, that's it. I'm sick of being healthy. I want all my teeth to fall out and my spine to collapse. So I'm going to become a vegan. Those, by the way, are symptoms that were reported by an author, Leah Keith, in her book describing the health problems that she suffered from in decades of being a vegan.
I see. Wow. I can't believe that people want to do this diet. But, people are brainwashed, Tucker, to believe that vegetables are the key to health. And so people think, well, hell, if you just eat vegetables all day, that sounds like you'll be as healthy as can be.
Yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't seem to work that way. And we can see that with, the Seventh-day Adventists, the folks who are overrepresented in the nutritional profession because they view it as missionary work, have published a lot of studies showing that they are healthier than the average American. And that's true. They don't drink, they don't smoke, they have a good community around them, all beneficial things. The important thing to note is that Mormons have all the same benefits, and Mormons eat meat, right? Mormons don't drink alcohol, they don't smoke cigarettes, they don't drink, they don't take caffeine, but they do eat meat, and they have similar health benefits to what the Adventists claim. So why are the Mormons doing so well if it's all about the meat? It's a religious issue. And Part of the Adventist creed is reducing fat and cholesterol. Gee, does that sound familiar? Now, the biggest problem with the Adventists is they're not honest about what they're doing, and that was the complaint that Dr. Klurfeld of the USDA had, and his recommendation was that a religious affiliation like the Adventists have, where they believe they should be dietary missions, needs to be disclosed as a conflict of interest by scientists, right? Just as if, I've got an association with this company, Zero Acre Farms, and they are coming out to produce a healthier, we think, feed oil. If I didn't ever disclose that, I could be accused of misrepresenting myself, right? Well, the Adventists do this every day. They don't have to tell anyone that they're an Adventist. We don't even know how many of them are represented in nutrition science, because unless the study's actually coming out of an Adventist university, you have no way of knowing, and they have no obligation to tell us.
What do the online vegan community think of the Adventists?
Nothing coherent.
Do they like them? Do they see them as the Jedi Order of their community, or do they see them as conservative Christian weirdos that kind of agree with them, or how do they frame them?
Honestly, most of the folks I've talked to deny any connection to the Adventists, and that includes a lot of registered dietitians who, up until recently, when I guess they decided it was bad PR, the dietitian profession had an annual dinner celebrating the Adventist founder of the profession. And when I said, hey, you're influenced by this religious group, they would say, no, we're not. And I said, well, then why do you have a dinner every year celebrating her founding your group? Well, change topic, right? They won't honestly discuss it.
Right.
And I think the reason they won't honestly discuss it is that, first off, in the United States, we're not supposed to have an establishment of religion. And if our dietary guidelines are the result of a religious sect pushing their religious views on the rest of us disingenuously, then that is them imposing their religion on us. And now, through this Eat Lancet movement, they're trying to do this to the whole world, right? They want to ban eating meat as much as they possibly can.
And that's because it's a moral issue for them. They feel like it's a terrible thing to do that, right? It's a violation of rights, is the way I've heard them say it, right?
They feel it's a moral issue, but we should talk a little bit about how moral it is when one hears pretty frequently about vegan parents whose children die of malnutrition. And the World Health Organization years back came out with a report saying that a plant-based, high-carbohydrate, low-meat diet was the cause of malnutrition in 2 billion people on this planet, right? And we have multiple RCTs looking at how to cure stunting in human children who are on a plant-based diet. And the next best thing to do is milk. The best thing to do for them is give them meat. And without meat or milk, their cognitive abilities suffer. They grow up stunted. They're not as strong. They have impeded muscle development. These are human children. And we know, because of science, that we can give them meat and we can get rid of most of these problems. Right? So basically, they're advocating a program that we know causes human malnutrition. How is that moral?
Right. And isn't it true? They don't like this argument. They really don't like it. But isn't it true, the point that I make a lot, that you kill way more woodland animals by displacing their natural habitats with monocrop culture? And then, of course, the harvesting kills lots of animals that make their little way in the cornfields, and then you're killing bug life, you're killing birds, you're killing moles and voles, and of course larger fauna that would have been displaced when they take over a piece of wildlife, wild woodlands, and turn it into a crop of broccoli, fields of broccoli or whatever, right?
Yeah, well, that was the point that Leah Keith in her book The Vegetarian Myth made very eloquently when she tried to start an organic garden and run it on vegan principles. And she realized that it was impossible for her to grow plants without killing things, right? I mean, just, you take a field and you go out and you plow the field and you kill uncounted thousands and thousands of rodents, right? As opposed to, say, having a steak where you killed a single cow.
Right. How does the vegan get out of that moral? If they're all about rights of the animals being violated, how do they get away from that reality? How do they say that's not rights of the animal being violated?
They don't. They don't have a response to it.
Wow.
Or some of them get into what they call sentience, where they say, oh, but they don't really think. I mean, now that we're discovering that, plants can communicate, I don't know where they're going to go next. There is actually a movement called the breatharians who believe that you can survive on nothing but air. Please, listeners, don't try that one at home.
Man. What are they going to think up next, huh? That's a terrible question to ask, isn't it? Because it usually ends up badly.
Well, yeah. And I mean, it's just, So, folks, the takeaway from this is when you hear people recommending Meatless Mondays for your kids' schools and recommending a vegetarian diet because it's good for the climate, they're not being straight with you about the evidence for these things, right? They are religious beliefs, and there are lots of scientists out there who are afraid to talk about this because they get attacked by these people. But you can go, if you do a little homework yourself, you can find out that, cows aren't the biggest source of greenhouse gases, and actually they're part of the carbon cycle, the natural process of, recycling carbon dioxide into the ground. They're a healthy part of a healthy environment. And if we go and all go vegan, not only are we going to get sick, but we're going to have to destroy millions and millions and millions of animals to make that dream happen, because monocrop agriculture is incredibly destructive of our environment.
It's also very destructive to in terms of pollution and carbon emissions, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it was Beyond. One of the fake meat companies, they made all these environmental claims and then they refused to back them up. They refused to do the research to show that what they were saying was actually true, right? That's a huge problem, because if you're claiming that we should all do something to save the world, you better have a pretty bulletproof case for it, I think.
Right. Well, Tucker, I really appreciate your time and your careful attention to this part of the culture about people getting a lot of misinformation. It doesn't mean that all plants are bad to eat and everything like that, but it just means that making that the only source of your nutrition and eating vegetable oils along with it's probably going to put you in a bad spot. So don't be afraid to push back. Thank you again, Tucker. And check out your website, yelling-stop.blogspot.com, and search for Tucker Goodrich on YouTube to catch all of his podcasts. Subscribe over there. And, of course, subscribe to What We Do, where you'll see a whole host of Tucker's appearances and many more exciting discussions on the way. So that's it for A Neighbor's Choice, folks. You can email me hello@aneighborschoice.com. I'm David Gornoski. Godspeed.